So thank you very much to Dr. Nicole Renehan, who is actually joining us from Australia today. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview with us. And we're here today to talk about your current research, which focuses on domestic violence perpetrator programs that work with neurodivergent men. So my first question for you would be, what is neurodivergence, and why did you decide to focus on this topic for your research?
Hi, thanks for having me, and it's a real pleasure to do it from Australia at the same time as well. So neurodivergence is a term used for people who diverge in some way from what would be considered a norm in terms of sort of neurological or brain function, and that could categorise within that includes people who are dyslexic, dyspraxic, someone who had an acquired brain injury, or as well depression, episodic. It's classed as sort of an acquired neurodiversity. So that can include also people who may have a so-called personality disorder or depression. And it also includes people who are autistic and have ADHD. And I suppose what's really important to try and point out that neurodivergence is typically being understood within what's called a medical model. So typically seen as a disorder and is sort of described in terms of some sort of impairment or some sort of deficit. When we think about autism, ADHD, or in terms of an impairment of social communication, understanding, or executive functioning. Whereas there's another model or movement actually, which refers to neurodiversity, so sees instead of a disorder, a difference that we all, there's variations, a natural variation in terms of neurological development, and just like biodiversity, it's great for human development, is something that's needed as well. So in terms of my research and why I'm looking at the moment, I'm interviewing practitioners and trying to understand what services across the UK and Australia have perhaps adapted their service in some way for autistic and ADHD men. And the reason I decided to look into autism and ADHD specifically was because as part of my PhD research, I interviewed two men, one who was autistic or was awaiting an assessment, and someone who had been diagnosed with ADHD in childhood. And that was quite unexpected. And because it was such a small cohort that I interviewed, it was quite surprising to come across two neurodivergent men. And when I looked into the literature, I found that there was no programs for men who were autistic or had ADHD, that it wasn't mentioned in the typology literature. So when we look at sort of the differences of domestically violent men within the literature, they're not included in any of the typologies. And in some ways, because these men didn't have a learning disability as well, it was perhaps quite difficult to pick up. So because I hadn't expected this and it only came through the data, I didn't have an opportunity to ask practitioners about this either. So I decided then to interview people across the world who have been working with this cohort and to see what actual service that are, looking in particular at obviously the UK and Australia. So that's how I've come to this point.
Okay, super interesting. Thank you. I was wondering, when I heard about your research, you were talking to many different programs about the width of the services that they offer. And I was wondering whether in your research, you generally see that perpetrator programs are prepared to work with quite diverse groups of men, what your results have been in that direction.
So I suppose I could answer that in two ways, or interpret in two ways. Are they prepared in the sense that, are they willing? Absolutely. Absolutely, but I don't think anyone who I've spoken to within my previous research, looking at because I looked at the Building Better Relationships programme in England and Wales for men who've been convicted of a domestic violence offence, and people who I've spoke to more recently around my current research have been really, really interested in it. And even if they didn't feel they could contribute, they were really interested, said they were really interested in the results. But if I take you, I suppose, just to the Building Better Relationships project, the facilitators, whilst they were willing to work with a group of diverse men and recognise they were working with a group of diverse men, they didn't feel perhaps as equipped as they could or should be to work in more responsive ways. And I suppose if we look at the Building Better Relationships programme, it had a review, and it replaced its previous Duluth model programmes because it wanted to work with a diverse range of men. But facilitators really sort of said that actually while they sort of found that some of the techniques, particularly looking at emotional management, etc., and cognitive skills and relationships, that the men that they were working with, and we can look at this in terms of neurodivergence as well, where men had depression or perhaps were showing what would be borderline or antisocial tendencies, that particularly they didn't feel able to work with men who had sort of real emotional vulnerabilities. And I suppose the programme doesn't actually purport to do so anyway. In terms of thinking about neurodivergence of autism, ADHD, that isn't something that is currently a focus within that programme. And I think when I've talked more widely with international experts, I've only come across one organisation in the US who actually work with just a group, just with neurodivergent men. So I suppose coming back to whether people are willing to work with diverse men, yes, they want to, but perhaps the resources aren't there to help them to do so, or the understanding, particularly thinking about autism and ADHD, because perhaps there aren't those screening tools, or we aren't asking people about this. The data doesn't actually exist out there for people to then be able to put a case forward in terms of what they need. So that's part of what my research has been doing, looking into all of this. So I can talk from the perspective of my PhD research, whether they're prepared. In some ways they are, in some ways they aren't supported to do so, and programmes sometimes are only there and catch a little bit. So willing, but the resources are lacking, I would say.
So I think it's actually kind of interesting that you're actually maybe proposing a new type of perpetrator work as well, with men who might classically be excluded from the programs that we have.
I think what I'm finding is that that people aren't necessarily excluding. So I suppose this might be a little bit of a preliminary sort of finding. So they're not necessarily excluding on the basis of ADHD, autism. They're more looking at risk. I think the problem is, because we need to be careful that we're not suggesting that autism and ADHD cause domestic abuse. We can't medicalise domestic abuse. We know that those happen for other reasons. But I think the problem is that they're not recognising they're working with these people in the first place, particularly autism and ADHD, because it's so invisible. And I think one of the things I found is when I talk about my research, people automatically assume that I'm talking about men with learning disabilities, and I'm not. And that's what makes these men even more invisible. So, and in some respects, I think they're also finding this with people with acquired brain injury, but I think there is far more research out there on acquired brain injury and domestic abuse than there is with autism and ADHD. That's almost non-existent.
I was thinking about this intersection of doing research on domestic violence and this medicalisation that you were talking about. And I guess I was interested to hear how you see your research on that intersection and what your stance is on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm writing just now about this, so I'm sort of trying to work on a paper to talk about the couple of men that I was explaining to you about earlier. And one of the key things that I do try to get across is that their domestic abuse can be understood by asking them about what happened, asking them about what led them to the programme, asking them about what happened within the context of the incidents, what's happened to them in their lives, what's brought them to this moment. And actually, when you sort of interpret, look at the data, for me, looking at previous research, there's no difference in terms of thinking about aspects of male entitlement. There's certainly a lot in terms of their upbringing and the vulnerabilities, that lack of emotional care or capacity to cope with difficult situations, the need to sort of reproduce that emotional care that they didn't receive in childhood. So in terms of trying to understand why they do it, they're no different. And what is different and the additional difficulties that these men had was the other multiple difficulties, experiences because of perhaps a misdiagnosis of autism, or so for the autistic guy who was awaiting his assessment, he was sent off to a special school for boys with emotional and behavioural difficulties, where actually someone failed to pick up that he was being abused and violently attacked in the home, and that his daughter just recently been assessed as autistic, and it was clear that he'd done, when he talked about her, he'd been doing sort of this masking throughout his life and had experienced horrific mental health issues, feeling sort of abandoned and left out as a result. And the guy with ADHD, he had been excluded from almost every service that would have been able to have offered him support. So they had those additional barriers, but coming back to whether, and that key point of medicalisation, you can't medicalise domestic abuse. It may feature in some way, sort of feeling even more overwhelmed in terms of the loss that they've had in their lives, and perhaps in that moment feeling overwhelmed in terms of not wanting to lose the relationship. That's no different from any man who is using violence in the relationship. But the studies, the very small amount, are out there. We know that the majority of people with ADHD are not violent towards the partners, and we know that autistic people, the majority, are not violent towards their partners either. So there's something else going on for these men in programs, if that makes sense.
You've already started going into it a little bit, and I was wondering whether there are any preliminary findings from your research that you would feel comfortable sharing with us at this point.
Yes, so I suppose I'll probably emphasise that point. There's probably 2 or 3 things that would be useful to say here. When I've sent out my survey, there's quite a few people that have come back saying, oh, this is interesting, but we don't work with this cohort. And again, because there's no screening or no questions, unless it came already attached to someone's record before they attend the programme, that's something that isn't sort of screened for. Organisations aren't doing this, and I'm assuming there are good reasons for having not to doing so far in terms of people's medical records, privacy, etc. But people are saying that would be helpful to know. But what I found talking to neurodivergent practitioners, so who are neurodivergent themselves or are parents of neurodivergent children, they are recognising that they are working with autistic ADHD men that other people, other facilitators, practitioners actually aren't picking up. And that sort of takes me on to the second thing around what they are saying is that perhaps because they aren't picking this up, they're perhaps thinking that the men are just behaving belligerently or they're not engaging, and that can go down on a progress report. But actually that might just be to do with perhaps blurting something out because there are issues around sort of what they would say executive function, not being able to wait turn, or someone who's not perhaps giving eye contact or looks like they aren't engaging in the programme in some other way for reasons that they're just not interested. And so that's a concern in terms of programme engagement, if we're trying to work with men to help them change the behaviour. But also a concern, I think, in terms of we need, I think, to really value then neurodivergent practitioners and what they bring. So that would perhaps require recruitment strategies that would say, actually, we welcome people to be facilitators from minoritized communities, and that should include neurodivergent communities being able to celebrate the contribution that they bring to this type of work, and also perhaps allowing, not knowing that neurodivergent people are already working with them, so to make that a place, make a workplace safe for people to sort of come out and be able to say this. And I suppose what I would also finish on that is extremely important is my learning is still developing. I consider myself an ally of neurodivergent people, and I continue to learn every day by asking neurodivergent people about what they think, constantly checking my language. What do neurodivergent people need? What are their experiences? Neurodivergent people aren't all the same as neurotypical people aren't all the same. And therefore, working with people who are neurodivergent requires an individualized approach. Some may want to stay within group work, but may require perhaps sensory aids, or they may require more time for processing. People with ADHD perhaps might need some more understanding around timekeeping and not being kicked off of programs because they've not turned up on time 2 or 3 times. So there's lots of things there to be considering, but a key thing certainly listening to neurodivergent communities about what their experiences are and what they need, rather than the usual neurotypical person suggesting what they might need.
Thank you. Since it is your wish to close on that, we'll leave it at that. Thank you again so much to Dr. Nicole Renehan, who joined us today from Australia to do this interview with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having me.